So, thanks for listening to this online lecture. Um, I'd like to start by talking a little bit about what we did last week. So, last week we talked about travelers and tourists, and we contrasted different ideas about what travelers and tourists do, and we looked at a few specific examples. So, for example, we looked at people who were really seekers of knowledge, people like Harriet Beecher Stowe and Ralph Waldo Emerson, people who traveled to Paris in order to expand their knowledge of a certain area like art in the case of Stowe or natural history in the case of Emerson. And then we looked at socially conscious travelers, people who had political or social ideas, and they brought those with them when they traveled to Paris. They were really comparing different social and political situations in their own country and in France. And then we had people who were a little bit closer to regular tourists, who were more sightseers, or even we could call them pranksters in the case of someone like Mark Twain, who was always on the lookout for a scam, or is always arguing with his guide, is always suspicious about what's being offered to tourists. And then we talked a little bit more generally about what it's like to be a tourist. What are the problems that tourists face? For example, that they're pressed for time. They have a limited number of days or weeks that they can use to visit a specific place, and then they're restricted by their budget. Right? They only have, it's a very expensive trip for most people, and then they only have so much to spend for that amount of time. And those things also make them even more reliant on guides, whether those are books or people. They have to turn to those people so they can get the most out of the time that they have. And what this creates is this mixture of pleasure and stress. And that was something we saw in that little short film by the Coen brothers, the one in which we see the actor Steve Buscemi, who's playing this man who's in a metro station, and he's studying his Paris guide, and he's fascinated by what he reads. It's so exciting about the city of love, but at the same time he's frightened. He doesn't know what to do. He doesn't follow what the guide tells him to do correctly. Right? He makes eye contact when he shouldn't. He doesn't understand what's happening around him. So it's a little comic movie, but it also really highlights those aspects of being a tourist, that mixture of anticipation and fear. And those are things that we'll see among many tourists over time as we go along. Now, American tourists are often criticized, especially by other Americans, for being self-absorbed, for staying in their own tourist bubble, for not seeing life as it is for the people in the country they visit. But earlier travelers to Paris, before the modern tourists, suffered from the same difficulty. They came to Paris for their own pleasure or edification, as we saw last week, but they landed in a city that had suffered terrible violence and political upheavals, things about which they seemed to know very little and often not to care very much about. American writers in general, even today, tend to convey what Paris means to them, and there are countless books and essays about my Paris, things that include only the occasional French neighbor or the interesting shopkeeper who provides a touch of French flavor to an American experience. So let's go back. Let's return to the time long before the most famous Americans arrived. What was the French experience of Paris during the 19th century? It's very hard to describe this age, which consisted of repeated wholesale destruction of the city and rebuilding, repeated, vast, costly rebuilding on an unprecedented scale. We're going to look at the 19th century, the good and the bad, and we'll look at a couple of different areas. We'll talk about overcrowding and urban misery. We'll talk about something called the Zone, the July Revolution, which you read a little bit about, and Haussmann's Paris, which you saw in the film that you watched for this week, that Insider's Guide to Paris. We'll also talk about the Franco-Prussian War and something called the Paris Commune. Now, at the beginning of the 19th century, Paris is associated with magnificent historic monuments and artworks, but Paris was also famously filthy, unsanitary, vermin-ridden, disease-plagued, rotting, Before 1830, the city had no sidewalks at all, so people walked in streets filled with carts, animals, refuse tipped out of the windows. And when Victor Hugo published The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1830, he noted the state of neglect and near ruin into which the cathedral of Notre Dame had fallen at this time. But not only novelists worried about the city. For its political leaders and for scholars who studied it, as well as for readers of the popular press, Paris was the capital of crime in France. And you can see here's a very popular work, The Mysteries of Paris. And there you can see a murder taking place right in the middle of this street or dark alley, whichever one you want to call it. This sort of story is quite popular. And Paris is the place where people first begin to conceive of crime as the product of an entire class of people, the criminal underclass that supposedly flourishes in urban filth. Now, why does this come about? Well, partly it's an issue of population. As you can see from these numbers, the population of Paris was climbing steadily. The most dramatic experience for those in the city was during the first third of the century. And as you can see, that the population more than doubles between 1801 and 1846. And most of that happens before 1830. And so this is in the first third where the largest population growth happens. The most dramatic population growth is really visible for people in the city. And yet the growth of housing in Paris just doesn't keep up. So what happens as a result? Obviously, overcrowding, poor sanitation, trash, sewage, disease outbreaks, things like the cholera epidemic you read about in the McCullough chapter on Morse. And then the other results are efforts to counter these problems, things like workers' associations, political movements, social movements, and the development of the first real social sciences, right? Political and economic theories based on observations of actual conditions. So parallel to this was the growth of the idea that crime wasn't simply a set of bad actions, but a sort of biological product of a class of people, the poor, who were kind of naturally a criminal class. So these are two, sometimes these ideas run together and sometimes these ideas are separate, right? There's an idea of people are simply naturally criminal and an idea that it's external forces that cause these kinds of things like disease and crime. Right? And those are competing theories in the 19th century, in some ways as they are today. So just to give you an idea of the level of poverty, right? Nearly 40% of the Paris population in the first third of the century relied on some sort of public relief, like the kind shown in this painting of an early morning soup kitchen. Okay. So the other result of this is popular political uprisings. The first major uprising is in July 1830. Charles X is removed from the throne. This is Parisians revolting against a ruler who fails to address the needs of the majority of people and who actually tried to undo some of the gains that this majority had made after the French Revolution. He was replaced by Louis Philippe, the one mentioned by so many American visitors, one who had spent time in the United States, who had even living in Boston, above the Oyster House. And then this ruler is removed by another uprising in 1848. And these appeals of 1830 and 1848, which feature citizens barricading the streets, common people flinging paving stones at soldiers, the burning of buildings, all of this reinforced the vision of Paris as a dangerous place, and Parisians in particularly as a very, very dangerous sorts of people. Now, Paris began to change dramatically in two phases. First, in 1841, a new military wall surrounded a larger area around the city. So in a sense, the boundaries of the city expanded and extended the territory of what was called Paris. So that meant that there was a large amount of unbuilt land that was now dotted with little clusters of dwellings. There were villages that were suddenly incorporated into the city. And the barriers, the gates of this wall, became passages to a sort of duty-free zone. So here you can see the extension and where these fortifications are, and then there are gates all around the edges. And here a painting of what some of this looks like. You can see there's sort of a mixture. There seems to be some sort of industry. There's smokestacks there, but then it's semi-rural. There are chickens and other animals. It's definitely unclear what this is. This is supposed to be Paris. This is apparently part of Paris, right? This is the edge of Paris. And then the barriers. This is one of the barriers. What's going on here? Well, the area outside of those city walls is a kind of a duty-free zone. There are no city taxes. And there's also not the same police surveillance. So you could go outside and buy cheaper alcohol and all sorts of other things, but people did all kinds of other shopping business outside of these walls that they could get out there. But it also became a kind of unregulated zone, right? Room for all sorts of activity. And then you can see there's also some industrial development out there just because there is this space, and we'll talk about that some more later. The next phase, let's see, okay, here's another view from the fortifications too, also just to see that mixed area. Right? And here's one of the barriers that continue. Some of these barriers actually stay in place up until the turn of the 20th century. They're not all of them demolished until the late 1920s. But you can see here people coming and going. And you can even see those mounds of fortifications on the side. Okay. Here's the next phase. Right? This is in 1852 when Napoleon III appoints Baron Haussmann as the prefect of the Seine. And so he's the prefect of this region of Paris. And what this title means is that he has the authority to remake the city according to a new and modern design. So this is this period of what's called the Second Empire after the fall of the revolutionary government and of Napoleon I after the July Monarchy. Napoleon III was determined to build lasting monuments that would secure the image of the government that he created. And in an age when governments often died with their leaders, he felt that the built environment would give both the impression of continuity and the means for sustaining the institutions he created. So for that reason, he gave Haussmann a very free hand, and the prefect redesigned Paris with a will, overseeing the building projects for 17 years. And here you can see this is also very modern kind of building and design. This is construction. The digging of foundations is going on at night with lights. You can see scaffolding has been set up. So work is going on essentially around the clock, and large parts of Paris are being changed. And here, this is around the Opera, and you can see buildings are going up, others are being knocked down, but there's a lot going on. Okay, and this is a little bit more unusual. This is a river that used to run through parts of Paris, and it had turned into a kind of open sewer. So people were just dumping all kinds of things into the river. It was very unpleasant. It was not safe to drink or to really to dip your hand in. But it flowed through Paris, and so this river is mainly placed underground. Even today, most of the river runs underground. Now, of all the changes Haussmann introduced, the most universally applauded were his new boulevards. Right? These streets, which were both longer and wider than previous streets, the longest being the Rue Lafayette, which was 5 kilometers. And if you look at a map of Paris, you'll notice that the city hasn't been laid out on a grid like Chicago or shaped around mathematically determined diagonal streets, a little bit like Washington, D.C. The boulevards were cut in order to facilitate ease of travel around the city, and they often linked major train stations to central points. However, their architectural and visual function often superseded their practical one. So first, whole neighborhoods were torn up in order to make route for these new routes. He cut 53 new streets, and these include every major artery in Paris except the Champs-Élysées. He also directed streets towards existing monuments wherever he could, but he didn't mind moving monuments, as you saw in that film, like tearing down a church, or even creating new ones in order to balance of visual effect. So a key to much of Haussmann's construction was not just regularity, but the illusion of regularity. He could construct a boulevard that appeared to stretch from the Place de la Bastille to the Pantheon, but in reality didn't actually permit you to walk that path. Right? The eye can connect the monuments of Paris, but not necessarily the person walking. The visual organization of Paris, including even the building of streets to highlight particular architectural gems or cultural treasures, was central to his project. So as we saw that construction around the opera, this is an area where it's surrounded by streets named after famous composers, and the opera itself is designed in this extraordinarily luxurious style. Another street was intended to give access to the Sorbonne and the College of France, so linking two institutions of learning physically and then creating this district centered around education. So you can think about this as, in a sense, remaking the city around planned neighborhoods. Haussmann also frequently removed buildings from their historical context, as he did by creating empty space around the Cathedral of Notre Dame. In that instance, he demolished a kind of hodgepodge of rickety buildings that had existed on the Ile de la Cité in the heart of Old Paris and replaced it with an island of government buildings. But in other cases, he was less concerned about this. And he often created little urban itineraries from places where you could walk, right, routes that passed through different parts of the city. But as you can see here in this image, this is by an impressionist painter called Caillebotte. Equally important in Haussmann's construction was the standardization of building design. The uniform look of the city, which some people have mentioned in the course of our discussion, was not only determined by the new streets, but also by the architecture. Haussmann's new buildings were in a Beaux-Arts style, and new ordinances determined how high buildings were permitted to be in proportion to the width of the street, even the depth of balconies. So these many paintings with balconies are really showing us a new design element. So things like depth of balcony, ornamental metalwork, all of that were determined by Haussmann. Of course, the wealthy residents of certain areas were not ordered about as were the poorer residents of the city, but they were told to work together in order to ensure uniformity across the facades of buildings. And these are, again, privately owned buildings. And in addition, as you can see here, and again, this painting, the new lines of the city were underlined by Haussmann's planting rows of chestnut trees in the center of Paris, and the trees underline these visual effects. So just to give you an idea of the visuals, like here, again, you see this sense of openness, the uniformity of buildings, the perspective, right here too, a sense of what is at the time a kind of real modern design, like wide streets, lots of space for walking, and an emphasis on clean and approachable, walkable city. Here too, and a sense that everything is being changed, or things are being transformed in many different ways. Now, the other thing to think about, and it was a question that people were asking also in the discussion, is what happens to those who are displaced by this construction in the middle of the city? One thing that happens is that new districts of Paris are added in 1859, along with communities surrounding Paris. And this is about doubling the size of the city. So one thing that happens to people is that they are essentially moved out into these unbuilt areas. Especially the poorer populations of the city are displaced from the center, and they're moved out towards the edges. And that's a development that has continued from the 19th century into the 20th and even into the 21st century in many large cities around the world. When there's urban renovation, or what is often called slum clearance, what happens is that these buildings that are in poor condition are removed, the sanitary facilities are improved, but that means that the poorest residents are often priced out of the center of the city. This doesn't happen to everyone. Haussmann's buildings have provisions for mixed income levels in the same building, but it does mean that a lot of people are displaced from the city. And so, as I mentioned before, this large area around the outside of the city is largely unplanned area. Some of it has sewers, water supply, there are streets, but there isn't the same infrastructure, and these areas lag behind the center of the city. There are still some of the uniform building sizes in these new districts. Areas are planned for the future, but new apartment buildings, even in those districts, are built of different materials from those in the center of the city, and they have very little ornamentation. They're built for families with no servants. Some were actually more comfortable than the apartments in the center of the city, just because they were newer buildings. But often, larger parts of these districts are poor areas, housing those who can't afford to live elsewhere. But then, in 1870, Paris again changes dramatically. We have a report on September 3rd, 1870. A writer, Edmond Goncourt, writes, "What a sight! The news of MacMahon's defeat and the capture of the emperor spreading from group to group. Who can describe the consternation written on every face? The sound of aimless steps pacing the streets at random, the anxious conversations of shopkeepers and concierges on their doorsteps. Then there's the menacing roar of the crowd, in which stupefaction had begun to give place to anger." Louis Napoleon, the Emperor Napoleon III, had declared war on Prussia and been defeated in the Battle of Sedan, captured by the enemy. In fact, he had been more or less lured into declaring war on Prussia, outmaneuvered by Prussian strategy at a point when they knew that it would be a relatively simple victory. He foolishly declared war and was quickly defeated. Many of those who had deplored the repressive government of Napoleon III now welcomed France's defeat, hoping that it would usher in a new, more liberal government, a republic, and an era of greater freedom. The writer George Sand, a woman known for writing romantic novels, and a writer who had asked the emperor for clemency for people who had rioted in 1848 asking for democracy, was now 66. She was thrilled. She was among many people who were thrilled. "This is the third awakening. It is beautiful. Hail to thee, Republic. Thou art in worthy hands, and a great people will march under thy banner after a bloody expiation." The writer Victor Hugo, who had left France and gone into exile in Belgium and then on the Isle of Guernsey, now felt free to return home. But return was bittersweet. Entering France, he encountered the forlorn remnants of the French army defeated at Sedan, and his feelings of vindication were turned to pity. Still, there seemed to be much to celebrate. The end of the empire was proclaimed, and a new republic formed in the city hall, that symbol of republicanism, where the revolutionary municipal government of Paris had been created in 1789. And now that the despised ruler had departed, many Parisians assumed that the German army would also depart. Bismarck, the Prussian chancellor, saw things differently. Instead of ushering in an era of freedom, the defeat at Sedan would lead to a terrible 4-month siege of Paris from October of 1870 to January of 1871. The city filled with troops who proved to be ineffective defenders and disastrous guests. The Field of Mars, just next to the military academy, provided space for an encampment that housed some 170,000 soldiers. These were the men who had already survived the French defeats on the battlefield and were now recovering as they prepared for an entirely different kind of battle. Graves were dug at Montmartre, which at that time was still on the edge of the city, and Edmond Goncourt spotted peddlers selling the soldiers paper and pencils to write out their wills. In order to defeat so many troops, whose numbers eventually swelled to 350,000 by the addition of National Guard soldiers. The army amassed vast quantities of food. Again, they're all being housed in this city. As far as the eye can reach, wrote the Paris correspondent of the Manchester Guardian, over every open space, down the long, long avenue, all the way to Longchamp itself, nothing but sheep, sheep, sheep. The forest on the edge of the city, the Bois de Boulogne, is said to have been home to 250,000 sheep and 40,000 oxen at the time. Unfortunately, inept management of resources and uncertainty about the duration of the siege meant that in the early days, many people still dined as usual. Restaurants and cookshops sold food without any constraint, and food supplies quickly began to run out. Much sooner than expected, the situation became desperate. By mid-December, a resident and writer for the London Daily News was telling his readers, "I had a slice of spaniel the other day." The elaborate sauces that were necessary to render dishes palatable meant that rats were essentially a rich man's dish, hence the notorious menus of the Jockey Club, which featured such delicacies as salami de rat and rat pie. As weeks passed, Parisian diets grew even more outlandish as the zoos started to offer up their animals. Victor Hugo was given some joints of bear, deer, and antelope by the curator of the Jardin des Plantes, while kangaroo was on the menu of the Goncourt's favorite haunt. Wickham Hoffman, a diplomat at the American legation, declared preference for light gray horses over black ones. To make matters worse, Bismarck's General von Moltke had decided that he could hurry things along by bombarding the civilian population of the city. Shells fell into the city every day, into restaurants, marketplaces, and funeral processions, and they killed people from every walk of life. In combination with the other sufferings of the siege, this was too much, and the Parisians agreed to an armistice on January 28, 1871. French elections were held in February, and the Conservatives won the majority, installing Adolphe Thiers to the head of the government. It was Thiers who negotiated the settlement with the Prussians, a humiliating agreement which ceded Alsace and Lorraine and was to cost the French an indemnity, that is, payments to cover the Prussian war losses of 5 billion francs. The Prussians now occupied Versailles as well, and it was there in the famed Hall of Mirrors that the Prussian Wilhelm I proclaimed himself Emperor of Germany. France lost Alsace and Lorraine, was required to pay 5 billion francs, and Bismarck insisted on a triumphal symbolic march along the Champs-Élysées, deserted for that day by the saddened Parisians on the 1st of March, 1871. This was too much for those on the far left in Paris, and even the National Guard troops stationed in Paris joined the radicals in opposing Thiers. On March 28th, these radicals, with the help of National Guard troops who'd seized guns on Montmartre, declared their own government, albeit a local one, and it was called the Paris Commune. They called for local control instead of the domination of a central government. They demanded egalitarian treatment under the law. They advocated the separation of church and state and proposed the use of the National Guard instead of a standing army. These measures helped unite Parisians across the political spectrum and widen the support of leaders who had previously only been associated with smaller, less politically influential movements. And for that reason, because of its egalitarian goals, the Commune is usually thought of as a working-class rebellion, and certainly all major communist theorists have seen it in that way. Whatever else it may have been, the Commune was short-lived. By April, the French government, now also based in Versailles, had moved on Paris and begun to attack the communards. So here you can see the conflict that's happening in the city. These are barricades that are made in the city streets. Once again, the city was under siege, but this time it was the French government against its own citizens, the communards against their government, and any fellow citizens who looked like conservative sympathizers. Much of the central city burned. Sometimes fires were set for strategic purposes, sometimes for dramatic ones, and sometimes buildings burned by accident. A communard leader stacked barrels of gunpowder in the palace of the Tuileries and blew up the central dome. Other buildings deliberately set on fire included a large part of the Palais Royal, the Palace of Justice, the Prefecture of Police. Whole sections of streets were burned, as were the Ministry of Finance, which was housed at that time in one wing of the Louvre, and Notre Dame, which had escaped destruction during the French Revolution, was the site of an attempted burning. National Guards piled up chairs and pews, and they were just about to set it on fire when they were prevented. The City Hall of Paris, the focus of so much Parisian history since the Middle Ages, was also burned. The heaviest fighting and the final bloody battles of the Commune were fought in the last week of May in 1871, and the Communards took a last stand at Père Lachaise Cemetery. Why the cemetery? Well, for one thing, the western side of Paris housed the city's wealthier and more conservative citizens, those most sympathetic to the government. So it was from the west that the army advanced and entered the city, pushing eastward into the strongholds of Communard resistance. Père Lachaise lies on the edge of the city in the 20th arrondissement, and furthermore, it's up on a hill. So this elevation gives an excellent view of the city, a strategic advantage in wartime. And that was what allowed the Communards to hold their ground until they were picked off one by one. They were fighting behind tombstones. Still, the bloodshed didn't end there. The troops from Versailles had executed perhaps thousands who were either Communards or suspected of being sympathizers. But when they discovered that the Archbishop of Paris had been executed by Communards, they marched 147 of them to Père Lachaise, lined them up against the wall, and shot them all. In the end, between the bombardments, the street fighting, and the executions on both sides, at least 20,000 Parisians died. The Paris Commune still resonates in French politics. Père Lachaise houses a monument to the Communards executed there, and the cemetery serves as the focal point for rallies, usually by the left, but sometimes by the right as well. And the Commune left its mark on French artists too. The painter Manet was conscripted into the National Guard, and Auguste Renoir, found sketching by the Seine, was arrested and only barely escaped execution by the Communards. Remarkably, and really astonishingly, with only a few years, nearly all of the burned and battered government buildings and monuments had been restored, and the indemnity had been paid. These are just the last pictures of the Communards. France and the French bounded back, and American visitors once again streamed in to visit yet another international exposition at the end of the 19th century. The American novelist Henry James was writing his letters to the New York Tribune just 4 years after the Commune, and yet this devastating event merits not a word of comment in his reports. James, like Henry Adams, found the inhabitants of Paris distant and its social world difficult to enter. His closest friends were largely other American exiles or émigrés like the Russian writer Ivan Turgenev. And perhaps it was this exclusion that made many American visitors more acutely aware of themselves as Americans. Not being able to fit in could have the advantage of turning your observation towards your own identity. So those are things we'd like to think about as we look at the writing that has come out of this period and the readings that you've done for this week. What we'd ask you to do is to look at these text excerpts here. They're also in the document posted on Blackboard, and consider how each writer views Paris. What ideas do they bring with them to Paris? How are they changed by their experiences there? And then look at the questions at the end. So we have Elihu Washburn, and he describes seeing the political upheaval and seeing activity in the streets of Paris. What does he witness? What ideas does he bring with him? How does this affect him? Frederick Douglass. And how is he affected by what he sees in Paris? Henry Adams. Adams has a slightly different perspective on the city. What does he notice about it? Richard Harding Davis, the journalist. What does he say other people want to find in Paris? And what does he think the reality is? Isadora Duncan. What preconceptions does she have? And what interests does she have? Edward Steichen, the photographer. What's his purpose in Paris? James Weldon Johnson. How is he affected by his time in the city? Theodore Dreiser, we may talk about next week. So think about these questions. Take a look at what's posted on Blackboard. And finally, just give some thought to Morse in the Louvre, the image that you saw of Coppius in the Louvre, and the painting that Morse himself completed. How does he pursue his goals in Paris, and why is he distinctive, or is he distinctive among Americans of his time? So some questions to think about. How are Americans part of Paris at this time? What is their experience? What's distinctive about it? Do they really immerse themselves in what's happening in Paris? Or are they really focused on ideas or goals that they bring with them?